So today is very exciting because through the magic of webinars, we get to hear a cross-world conversation, cross-Atlantic, I guess. We're going to hear a writer based in Newfoundland, St. John's right now, who's going to interview a writer who is in London right now about her groundbreaking novel that goes back to the world of Shirley Jackson's classic, The Haunting of Hill House. So the book is, of course, A Haunting on the Hill, which is incredible. And I recommend everyone go get a copy from your local bookstore. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. Look at this gorgeous edition. Speaking of local bookstore, we have an official bookseller partner for this event, and that's our good friends from Iron Dog Books here in East Vancouver. They're based in a neighborhood called Hastings Sunrise. And so they're selling copies of the book for this event, and they can ship anywhere in Canada. So if you are in Canada, I really encourage that you buy it directly from our bookseller partners. And Dylan is going to share a link to this purchase page. He already did. From their website, and it's an Indigenous owned bookstore that we love working with. So please do that if you want to get a copy of the book. So let's get into it. I'm excited to introduce Elizabeth and David. So can you please join me on stage so people can see you? Wonderful. Nice to see you both. Elizabeth Hand is the author of more than 15 cross-genre novels and collections of short fiction, and her work has received the Shirley Jackson Award 3 times, nonetheless, and the World Fantasy Award 4 times, the Nebula Award twice, as well as a James M. Tiptree Jr. and Mythopoeic Society Awards. She's a longtime critic and contributor of essays to the Washington Post, the LA Times, Salon, Boston Review, and the Village Voice, among many others. It's an absolute pleasure to have you tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
I keep saying tonight because you're in the dark and I'm not in the dark, so it's the night for you. And David Demchuk's debut novel, The Bone Mother, was nominated for the Scotiabank Giller Prize, the Amazon Canada First Novel Award, the Toronto Book Award, and a Shirley Jackson Award, and it won the 2018 Sunburst Award for Best Novel. His latest novel, Red X, was listed as a Rakuten Kobo Top 20 of 2021, CBC Book Pick for Best Canadian Fiction of 2021, and a New York Public Library Best Book of 2021. So all these amazing accolades, and it's one of just 3 Canadian novels on that list, the New York Public Library Best Book. And so we will soon hear more about his 3rd novel, The Butcher's Daughter, which is co-written with debut author Corinne Lee Clark. So I'm thrilled to have you join us today as well.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you very much.
So what they're going to do is they're going to have a 40-minute conversation, more or less, and then they're going to take questions from the audience. So my only direction for the audience is make everyone's life easier, please, by submitting your questions through the Q&A button. So instead of putting your questions in the chat where they might get buried, please use the Q&A button. It's down there in your Zoom platform. And you can upvote each other's questions, so you don't have to type a similar question. You can comment on another person's question if you want to add an extra bit to it. So please use the Q&A button, and then David's going to take your questions at the end. That's it from me. David, take it away. Lovely to have you both here.
Oh, thank you very much, Jorge. And first, let me say to everyone, whoops. Happy Halloween. It is a tremendously appropriate time to be discussing this book, A Haunting on the Hill by Elizabeth Hand. And I couldn't be more thrilled to have Elizabeth here with us to discuss it. I'm going to enthuse about it for a few minutes and embarrass Elizabeth. This is a terrific book. And I am a tremendous fan, a huge fan of The Haunting of Hill House, and have been really since I was a teenager. And I can't imagine what it is like to be a writer who gets to journey into that world, into that house, and then create your own cast of characters and create your own drama within the house. It exceeded all my expectations. It's really, particularly for me, it's really rare that I get to the last 20 pages of a book and I don't know how it's going to resolve. And that's especially true for horror, because I'm very familiar with a lot of the tropes that people use in horror, the ones I use myself, and the ways that stories can play out. And I was consistently surprised and amazed all the way through. So if you have been on the fence about buying it, absolutely buy it, absolutely read it, get it from the library, do whatever you have to in order to do it, because it's a thrill to spend time in a place that feels both really familiar from the many adaptations, from the book itself, and yet also remains an alien landscape for us. So there you go. So that's my intro for you, Elizabeth, and for your book. My first question is, how did the book come about? It's unusual. I mean, Haunting of Hill House, I guess, has cast such a long shadow over the decades that almost every haunted house novel since seems to be in dialogue with it in secret. And you had the opportunity to engage directly, as well as to make your mark. How exactly did that come about?
Well, first, just to say thank you so much. I'm really glad that you, as another writer delving in the same sort of thing, that you enjoyed it. I had been in conversations about 8 or 9 years ago with the Shirley Jackson estate about doing a sequel to The Haunting of Hill House. They'd approached me and I think 2 other writers, and then, you know, and so we talked about it. I'd submitted some chapters and everything, and the project just got backburnered. I'm not really sure why. It just, I think probably there was another TV series or movie or something that they, you know, put their attention and time to. But then during the pandemic, in 2020, I heard back from Murray Weiss, who is the agent for the estate, and he said, you know, what do you think? You know, can we revisit this? And I said, yeah, I would love to. So he and I and Lawrence Jackson Hyman, who is Shirley Jackson's oldest son and executor, had a number of Zoom meetings in which we kind of bandied around different ideas and talked about what we did and didn't want to do. And I hit on this one, and they were really happy with it. And I wrote, I don't know, about 80 pages with an outline and submitted it to my publisher, and they were happy with it. And we were off to the races. But we, you know, we had a lot of discussions about other things. Could it be a prequel set in the Victorian era? Could we bring in a character who was somehow a relative of one of the other characters? And I said, no, if I'm going to do this and do a good job, you have to trust me, and I will write essentially an Elizabeth Hand novel that's set in Hill House. This is my 20th novel, not 15. That's, you know, floats around wrong information online. So I've written a lot of books, and I said, you know, if you want me to do this, you really kind of have to let me do what I'm going to do. And they were great. They said, yeah, go ahead. And I had pretty much total, you know, artistic control. And I was I was trepidatious about how, you know, what Lawrence especially would think of it, but he loved it. And I gather, you know, his siblings who read it liked it as well. So for me, I felt like, okay, that's kind of all I need. I'm very happy other people liked it, but it would have been really, it would have really not been good at all if they had not. I would have really felt like I let down the team, because it was sort of like, you know, Shirley Jackson, write a follow on to The Haunting of Hill House, no pressure. and, and so the fact that they were happy with it, I was hugely relieved.
Well, I mean, no pressure, I think, is really the key concept here, because I think it's hugely intimidating. and I mean, it would be a wonderful experience, but going to the keyboard every day, I mean, I would kind of have to remind myself to bring the temperature down and go, okay, yes, it's Hill House, but it is still, this is a thing I do all the time. I've written 20 books, like it would just trying to keep it into like sort of a realistic scope. But at the same time, one of the things that I really enjoyed about it was the way that you employed echoes from the original novel into the work without them dominating the work. And I thought that, first of all, that showed tremendous skill, but it did a lot to evoke, I mean, it's unfortunate we now think this way thanks to Marvel Comics, but it did evoke a kind of a Shirley Jackson universe. and that people had, people that you had created had wandered into it and were hearing, vestiges of things that had been said before, and seeing things that evoked, and hearing history that seemed very much to be the texture of that world, and the previous characters that had wandered among the walls and through the hallways, and I thought that was wonderful. How did you approach that? It felt like there was kind of a less is more attitude, but it was really, I thought, judiciously done. Did you feel like it was a mandate to bring in material from the previous book?
No, I didn't. As I said, they just gave me free rein. I had no direction. They just, like I said, this is a book. This is going to be an Elizabeth Hand novel. It's going to be set in Hill House. It will obviously be an homage to Shirley Jackson, but it's going to have to be a standalone book. I did not want to write a pastiche. I didn't want to try to write in her style. But by the same token, it's set in Hill House. And for me, Hill House itself is a character. So that was the one character that was a follow on from the original novel. So I had Hill House there with these four characters who inhabit it. And it seemed to me that the house would have this history, that there would be these echoes in it of what had happened before, things sort of seen from the corner of the eye, metaphorically speaking, not literally. And, the house has its own aura and manifestations, which we have seen if we've read experienced if we've read the original book or seen the movie, one of the movies. But for me, it was more important to just kind of bring my characters in there and set them loose and see what happens. Let them go and hijinks ensue. But I did want to have some Easter eggs in there for readers to pick up on. I wanted the book to be something, a standalone, so somebody who had not read The Haunting of Hill House could pick this up and read it, and then I would hope go and read the Shirley Jackson novel. But if you had read Hill House, I wanted to kind of have some shout outs there, like, okay, here's this, so people would read it and recognize it. But there's also that, the house has been not necessarily vacant, but 60 years have passed since the events in the Shirley Jackson novel in fictional time. So in those 60 years, there have been other people who have passed through Hill House. So, I mean, that's what I thought. And so they have left their own sort of psychic fingerprints, or whatever you want to call it, on the house itself. So my four characters who are there, they pick up on that as well. And they don't know what they're picking up on. They don't know the history. They don't know anything about Eleanor Vance from the original novel. They don't know anything about Theodora or Dr. Montague. They don't know about any of that. So they're going into it cold, but the reader does know something about that. So I wanted it to be sort of fun, a little trail of breadcrumbs for people to pick up on.
One of the things, there were so many things that just made me sort of go as I was reading. I guess it's about 75 pages in, so about a quarter of the way into the book, as we actually get to Hill House. The first section has all been first person from the point of view of a character named Holly, who is a writer director in theater who wants to put on an adaptation of a very old play, The Witch of Edmonton. And then at around the 75-minute mark, as the characters are arriving, you do a thing that I at first was really startled by and then really came to embrace, and that was you move to a second perspective, which was third person close, so that we were privy by turns to the minds and the experiences of all the characters inside the house. And I found that it, first of all, expanded the minds, like my experience of the minds of the characters. We were no longer confined to one person's perspective, but at the same time, really interestingly, it also created this feeling of claustrophobia because we were moving and shifting around them and getting into their heads and getting into their pasts, and it felt really like insidious and creepy. And then we would move back and forth, and it left me feeling very unsettled. I had been really confident that this was Holly's story and that we were going through it from what she was experiencing, and then we got pulled up. How did you approach that particular decision? Was it something that just arrived, or was this something that was part of the plan? What was the process like when it came to stuff like that?
Well, it was somewhat part of the plan. I definitely wanted to start with a first person narrative because, as you said, having that a first person narrator, you're kind of getting able to see more of what they're seeing. But it's also limiting, because you're only seeing that one perspective. So I wanted to bring in the other characters and have each one of them, the other three, have their vision of Hill House. And that is claustrophobic. I think that a very close third person point of view can have kind of a tunnel vision effect. And I thought that would work well for Hill House. But I also wanted to sort of play with this Rashomon way of looking at the story, where each one is sort of experiencing Hill House in a different way. They're all inhabiting the same place, but Hill House, if we're looking at it as a character, is working on each of them in a different way. So the house itself is sort of finding their weaknesses and preying on it and exposing it. And so having that close close third person, I think gives you a way of showing all this kind of entire spectrum of how people are reacting to it. But it also, as the reader and as the characters are reacting to it too, it's like, are they imagining this? Is this real? Is this, what's spooky? What's genuinely supernatural? And what is just kind of a big creepy old house? So I wanted the reader to kind of have that, experience that ambiguity, and the characters themselves are doing it because they, and by shifting between one or the other, you're getting this kind of fragmented sense of what the house is, because it's different for each one of them. Each one of them is having a very, very different experience of it.
Yes, absolutely.
None of them are very good.
No, I don't think anyone really relaxes at any point in Hill House. The guard is, pretty much from the moment they come in the door, the guard is always up. And I did really appreciate the fact, first, if you haven't read The Haunting of Hill House, as Elizabeth has mentioned, there's a character named Eleanor Vance, commonly known as Nell, and she is one of several people who were selected to investigate Hill House from a sort of a paranormal perspective. And she is clearly set up in the book, having had a paranormal experience as a child where she may or may not have manifested a rain of stones on the house where she lived with her mother. And it's clearly a connection to her arrival in the house and being selected as the weak link. What's interesting in this book is everyone has their weakness. It is not possible at the start of the book, or even midway through the book, to know who the weak link is in the house, if anyone. If the house is going to take one, all, none, someone else, a variety, it's so that too, it's not set up in the way that the first one is, which is sort of across like a supernatural / psychological tragedy. In this one, there's a great deal of suspense as the house itself sort of shifts around and tries to figure out, who am I going to go after and under what circumstances. And one of the characters, I'll talk about all of the characters eventually, but one of the characters that really fascinated me was Amanda. Amanda is an older actress. She has had a tragic accident in her past that has colored her career, and she has come to this production of the version of The Witch of Edmonton called Witching Night, trying to overcome a lot of this shadowed reputation that she has. And she's quite a bit older than the others. She's more mature than the others, but she has, as actors and performers, musicians do, she has her insecurities. And she seems, on one hand, more capable of dealing with what Hill House is doing to them, but at the same time feels really fragile. And I had wondered, I mean, I imagine the answer is that you identify with all your characters. I think that's natural for writers, but did you have a special connection with her? Because I felt that there was a lot there with her.
Well, she was fun to write because she is a woman of a certain age, which is roughly mine, and she's a performer. She's been a professional for her entire life, but she is, you know, she's of an age when she's not getting cast as much anymore because she's, you know, 65 years old. Whereas the other people in the house, two of them are about 40, and Holly's about 40, and her friend Stevie, they're, I don't know, 39, 40. And Nisa, Holly's girlfriend, is younger. She's early 30s. So Amanda is quite a bit older than all of them. And they're, you know, they're all performers of one type or another, or a playwright. So she feels very insecure because of this. And it was, you know, easy for me to kind of tap into that, even if I don't experience it myself so much. I mean, I'm not an actor, fortunately, I'm not a performer. You know, my face is not my fortune. So as I get older, that has not really been something that's been really terribly detrimental. But I know other professional actors and performers, especially women, who get really sidelined by that. So Amanda is experiencing that, and that is kind of, you know, they all at one point or another, as you said, you know, could be the weak link, and that's sort of, you know, the chink in her armor. So that is what I don't think I'm giving anything away, but, you know, that is sort of what the house is preying on with her. The house preys on the weaknesses of each one of them. And with her, it's sort of her vanity, her fear of aging, her fear of not being able to work anymore. So it, you know, I don't identify with that so much, but it was easy for me to kind of, you know, cast that on her. With each of them, in a way, Holly, who is sort of a failed playwright, who she had a successful play and then something happened, it kind of derailed her career. And then she's gotten this arts grant, and that's what's brought her to Hill House. She rents Hill House so they can rehearse the play with her grant money. So she's seeing this as sort of her big comeback, but she is very consumed with the fact that she kind of, you know, she lost her spark. She felt like she was going to had this big career, and then it was taken away from her. And that was something I really identified with, it because I am also a failed playwright. Fortunately, I found out about it when I was young enough that I could do something else with my life. But so that was very easy for me to tap into with her sense of, you know, really wanting something and feeling on the verge of something, and then having it taken away, and then having spent the, you know, the next almost 2 decades, you know, not doing anything, teaching in a private kids school, and you know, teaching theater there, but not doing anything professionally. So and she's the first person narrator, so that was, you know, she was very easy for me to write because I just kind of tapped into my own experiences, expanded on them, played with them.
I of course, I mean, I mentioned Amanda, and we've talked about Holly. There's also Nisa, Holly's younger girlfriend, who's an extraordinary singer, and Stevie, who is playing a male character in a dog, a devil dog in the play they're working on, and who also has had a difficult incident in his past that continues to haunt him. I really feel, and I felt this with Wilding Hall as well, your novella that was just a few years ago, that you have a real fascination with and affection for performers, for artists, for musicians, for actors, and where does that that come from? Is that from somewhere in your youth? Is that something that you've been close to in your life? I, as someone in the theater, like previously in the theater, really recognized all these characters. They were all immediately accessible to me. I had no trouble believing any of them.
Well, see, I not only am I a failed playwright, I'm also a failed actor. So I I had, I was in a BFA program for playwriting theater, very intensive when I was at university, and thought that's what I would do with my life. And then I found out fairly quickly that I just did not have talent for that at all. But I love the theater, and I have a lot of had then and still have a lot of people who were involved with theater or with music, with rock and roll or the performing arts. And it's just a world that I return to again and again in fiction. I mean, I write a lot about artists. I write about visual artists. I write about, I don't know that I've really written much about writers. Holly's a playwright, but I've written about musicians. I've written about actors. Illyria, which was another novella, is centered on a high school production of Twelfth Night. It's not a it's not a YA book, but it's set in a group of younger people. And my first novel, which came out 33 years ago, was a sort of a post-apocalypse novel in which there was a traveling troupe of actors who are going around this sort of devastated city performing Shakespeare. So it's something that from very early on in my writing that I've gone back to. I just I love it. And theater people, as you know, and as that people out in the audience may know as well, that they're interesting, and they are very often larger than life. They have they have to have powerful egos, because if they didn't have a strong sense of self, they would not be able to continue attempting to do the work they do. The risk of rejection in theater is, I think, much worse than it is even in writing, where there's always a constant risk of rejection. So there's just a lot to play with there in terms of creating characters and having them interact. People who are always jockeying for more stage time, more dialogue. People who are trying to get the audience's deflect the audience's attention from Hamlet doing his monologue, and you're over here. So it's just it's fun to write about them.
Well, and it was fun to read about them because, I mean, you have those moments where it's like, are they laughing about me behind my back? Are they trying to cut my part down? Are they? Why doesn't she credit me? Why aren't they paying attention to me? I'm the real star of this show. And that stuff is, I think, I mean, for people in theater, it may not be, but for readers, I think it's innately a lot of fun. There is that sort of like, it amps up the conflict. You have people who at the same time can be really petty and insecure, but also have tremendous charisma, tremendous confidence, if not in themselves, in the quality of their work, and their desire to create, their desire to be seen. I think these characters are really fascinating. And again, as the house is sort of like circling through them, you keep thinking to yourself, if you were just a little stronger inside yourself, maybe you would be able to resist the pull of the house and what's going on within it. One of the things that also surprised me, although it shouldn't have, you introduce some witches into the mix. Shirley Jackson had a fascination with witchcraft. She didn't write about it a lot, but she herself was really intrigued by it. And it actually ended up feeling like a really natural fit. How did that come about? And what's your interest in witchcraft as a writer, and particularly a writer in horror?
I love witches. I've always loved witches ever since I was a kid. And for this book, it just seemed like, a natural, because as you said, Shirley Jackson herself was really fascinated with witches. And my original working title for this book was actually The Witches of Hillsdale, Hillsdale being the town That's the name of the town Shirley Jackson used for where Hill House stands. So I just wanted to kind of play with that. I wanted to have it be an element in the story. It, sort of somewhat off stage, but they interact with the three women who may or may not be witches, interact with the players. And that was, again, something fun that I wanted to do. I just, people love witches. People always like witches. I just think they're perennially interesting and intriguing. And I think they're also figures and characters who can feel very contemporary, feel very modern. There's always, Wicca and neo-pagan elements are constantly being reinvented and used in our culture and in the arts, depictions in films and books and things like that. So I would have been very happy to just write something completely focused on the witches, but that would have been too much. That would have been over egging the cake with a haunted house.
I did really appreciate, though, that it also introduced a crack into which you could bring in some folk horror, particularly with the manifestation of a black hare, which of course in the area where Hill House is set, which is somewhere in New England, they don't exist. They're not common. There are snowshoe hares, but there are no other sort of like so-called black hares. They're something we strongly associate with a kind of I guess a British sort of folk tradition. And as a result, the juxtaposition was really creepy. The first time that a black hare appears in the novel, it's like, what the hell is this? What is going on? And it was and I have to assume, along with your enjoyment of witches, that you must also have an interest in folk horror. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Oh yeah, I love folk horror. I love folklore. I love folk horror. I think a lot of my work, I mean, folk horror is a very big umbrella term for a lot of different kinds of supernatural stories. But from almost the outset, certainly all of, I would say, I don't know, 75% of my work, I think, to some degree could be classified as folk horror. And I just love it. I love playing with folklore. I love playing with landscape. With this book, the landscape was less important because the landscape really was Hill House. But all of those elements in folk horror are things, I mean, and I love to read it as well. And I love, films, anything that has to do with it. And as I said, I wanted this, this was going to be my book. So I was going to put the things in it that I like. And I love folk horror. So I had elements of that in there, mostly through, well, with the black hares, but also with the folk songs that Nisa, yes, the traditional songs, the murder ballads that Nisa is adapting for Witching Night. So I was able to play with that as well. So yeah, it was just, I wanted to put all these things in there that I love. And because if I didn't do that, it would, I wouldn't want to write it. It wouldn't have been fun for me to write. But because I did have that freedom to put all these things in there, it was really fun to write. And I think readers have enjoyed it, most of them to some degree. So yeah, but the black hares they sort of came not quite out of nowhere, but that was not something that I had planned ahead of time. But when I was working on the book, there actually were 3 hares, not black, but varying hares, snowshoe hares in their summer brown coat. And they were playing in, where I work by my cottage. They were running around outside. Yeah, and sometimes I could stand outside and they would just run right over my feet practically. They were running around. So I was just really entranced by them. But then also I heard a song by a wonderful folk singer from Vermont in the US named Fern Maddie, F-E-R-N, Fern Maddie, M-A-D-D-I-E. And I have the information for where you can find her stuff in the book. And she had her debut album came out. It got this amazing review in The Guardian. They said it was like one of the best albums of the year. Anyway, she had a cover of a song called Hairs on the Mountain that just made my hair stand on end, no pun intended. But it was really a very eerie, beautiful cover. But what was strange too was that particular song, I had taken a verse from it as an epigraph from my novel, Waking the Moon, which came out a long time ago. So I thought, oh, wow, this is so strange. I feel like the Hares and Fern Maddie, they're all trying to tell me something. So they, they went into the book. But if you don't take anything else away from this Zoom event, go look up Fern Maddie's cover of Hares on the Mountain. You can find it online and listen to it. Watch it on YouTube.
Of course, I remember you crediting her in the book, and the way that you use the song is really intriguing, and points in several different directions to what the black hairs might be, what they might mean, if they are familiars, if they are in fact representations of the witches themselves. Or if they're their own sort of entity, and it's wonderfully ambiguous, and they kept me sort of mentally on my toes every time they showed up in one form or another, and that was and as you say that, as you talk about Waking the Moon, as we talk about Wilding Hall, it's clear to me that this is absolutely an Elizabeth Hand novel. This is very much integrated into your body of work. It feels like it is. There are continuing themes. There are continuing images. Is that something that is conscious when you're writing, that you want to employ material across your the scope of your work, or is it something that's just intrinsic? Is it something that's instinctive, that these things come forward and you go, oh look, here's this again, my old friend?
Yeah, I think it's probably more intuitive and intrinsic. I don't think about it in terms like, oh, I'm going to explore another one of my great themes here. And there are certain of my great themes that I feel like I have explored enough, and so I probably won't do them again. But I think as artists or writers or whatever kind of creative people we are, we kind of follow our muse, or follow whatever you want to call it, follow the piper who is playing this music that we as individuals find entrancing. And so certain things I just find really interesting. Folklore and folk music are two of those things. Certainly with Wilding Hall, there are some similarities with this. And when I was setting out to write A Haunting on the Hill, and I thought, is this going to be too much like Wilding Hall? And then I thought, nah. And even if it is, I don't care. I'll make it different enough that people, a lot of people will not have read Wilding Hall, for one thing, and I'll make it different enough that people will say, okay, well, again, this is a theme. And I don't know if I will do it again. I think that maybe I've played that hand now, and have no need to do it in another novel or story. But you never know. Never say never. I'm looking at the time. I just want to make sure we leave time for questions.
I'm going to go to questions just after one last one from me, and that one is: you've written a lot of dark fiction. I have too. Why? Why do we write horror? What attracts you to? Particularly, people, I think right now we're kind of going through, we always say this, it's always a difficult time. There's always a horror renaissance, but it feels like a lot of people are turning to horror right now. Readers, absolutely, but writers as well. What is it that draws you to horror?
I don't even think of it as horror. I just have always liked, spooky stuff, scary stuff ever since I was a kid. From the time I was quite young, I just wanted to tell ghost stories. I loved ghost stories. And it was just something that felt very natural to me. That was what drew me. That's what I was attracted to, reading them and seeing all those old, Chiller Theater and all those hokey old movies and some great movies too. And I think as far as just, the eternal allure of horror, that I read something today in the New York Times, I forget the name of the critic, but a film critic who writes a column for the Times about horror, and he said something which has been said before, but he said whenever we have we're living through a dark period in our history, in our world, and whatever terrors and anxieties are going on out there, horror or the supernatural in art and film and music and writing, it sort of holds up a mirror so that we can look into it and see, are we the monster? Who is the monster? You're holding up a magic window or a crystal ball or a mirror and looking at it. And I think it's just a way to sort of interpret all of the anxieties and terrors which exist in our own world. It gives us a way to control them. I can't watch scary movies. I will admit that. I have found that the only way I can really watch them is, I can watch some of them, but a lot of times you would be surprised at things that I can't watch. And I realize it's because the music, the scary music, is what really upsets me. And it's like, so I found I can watch these scary films or these scenes. I'll just turn the sound off and then I can watch it. So I have that control over it, and then I can go back in again and get scared and then go back another time and watch the whole movie. But I think, horror writing and film is able, gives us that power as well. We're able to put ourselves in that world, but we know when we close the book, when the movie ends, we step away from it. We are not, in fact, trapped in Hill House. Unless, I don't know, you might be, David. I'm looking at your place there. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, I gotta tell you, up until a year ago, I lived in a downtown apartment in Canada's largest city. And now I live in a house, an old house, a house that was built in, I think it was like 1893 or something. And there was a particular point in the book when you say, old houses, breathe, houses have a life of their, and it's actually true. When you're in an old house, it has that sense that you are in a kind of an organism, and you can be extremely pragmatic about that and go, yes, well, that's a draft, and that's a hole, and that's a this and that's a that. But it's not very hard to imagine where people get ghosts from, and particularly in old places, because you do kind of from time to time go, what's that cold thing on my shoulder? What's blowing the shower curtain open? The like weird things, and you just, so it does sort of, I don't know, I guess for me, for horror, it sort of falls into two camps. Part of it is that you're responding, as you say, to what's going on in the world and what's going on in the moment. But there are also, I guess, what I would describe as timeless fears. One of the things that I find really appealing about The Haunting on the Hill is that the characters feel very contemporary, but their anxieties are sort of hermetically sealed in the house and have a timeless quality to them. 20 years from now, when people read the book, there will still be the exact same kind of anxieties among performers, among other kinds of people. And so I think it will always be relatable. I think it's important to write stuff that has a contemporary element to it and that addresses the concerns we have in the present. Climate horror is a great example. It does a lot to raise awareness, and it does a lot to confront people's fears. But I like the timeless stuff too. I see we have some questions from Raphael, who I believe is in Germany. One thing that has always stuck out for me is how incredibly well you capture the feeling and atmosphere of a specific point in subculture, whether with the more acid and electric folk scene in Wilding Hall, or the early 90s in Waking the Moon, or anything else really. How do you go about distilling that essence for a specific era, or are you just picking moments that you're already emotionally invested in? That's a great question.
That is a great question, Raphael. Thank you. Yeah, it's kind of a combination of the two. Some of it, with Waking the Moon, I really did mine a lot of my own experiences. and people I knew for that particular era in DC. And for Wilding Hall, it was more my love of the music and, you know, being old enough to remember that era, the early 70s, and being able to fall down a rabbit hole and do an incredible amount of research to find out, which was great because I thought, oh, good, I could spend X amount of time just chasing every obscure Fairport convention, you know, video or interview I can find. I read a huge number of books and memoirs and autobiographies and things about that about folk musicians from that era and other musicians from that era. But I was able to kind of plug it into my own experience as well. I find it hard. I find it hard to actually make stuff up. So a lot of the time, the characters I write about are either, you know, loosely inspired by people I know. They're not actually the people I know, but I will take, you know, maybe the way I feel about this person, or, you know, having observed them, you know, some of their mannerisms, the way an actor will kind of take on another persona. Or I will look at historical characters, you know, real people, and write about them. So for Wilding Hall, you know, Nick Drake, the singer-songwriter Nick Drake, who is a brilliant and just one of my, you know, somebody whose work I just love so much. He was a character who really played into the character of Julian Blake in Wilding Hall. He was, to me, even the name was, you know, very much a very obvious nod to Nick Drake. But thank you. That's a great question.
And here we have two. So, and since we haven't dealt with either of them, we'll take them both one at a time. Might this iteration of the Hill House story become a film as well? Sorry if you've already talked about that. We haven't. Have you heard anything about whether there's any interest in adapting it to another medium?
Yeah, we have had people who are interested. You know, we've heard from people, but you know, nothing has happened yet. We haven't moved to the stage of somebody optioning things. You know, we've had conversations with directors who are interested in it, and so, you know, just have to wait and see. I'm kind of hoping that at some point it will be adapted for a movie, just because I think it would be really fun to see how somebody would really envision how they would build Hill House, like what it would look like. I'm really fascinated by architecture, so I would love to see what somebody did with that, like what their Hill House looked like, how it different from mine, how it differs from mine, how it differs from Shirley Jackson's.
Oh, for sure. I mean, there is, I mean, as we've discussed, there's a certain amount of interiority in the novel as we're moving through people's thoughts and impressions, but there is a definite visual and I would say visceral element to it that lends itself to that kind of treatment. And it would be really intriguing to see, particularly since we've had several versions of Hill House over the years, none of which necessarily matches any other. And then, of course, you know, as I've suggested, we've had a few unofficial Hill Houses as well, that or Hill House inspired kind of haunted houses, and I just from a purely architectural point of view, just from the creation of spaces in which things can happen, I find them really intriguing, just really innately interesting as stories and as visual stories. The second question is, have either of you ever experienced a supernatural event yourselves? You go first.
Yeah, I did. I don't know. Well, I would say I experienced an inexplicable event with two friends when we were, I guess we were maybe 13, 14, some of us 13, 14 years old. And I wrote about it in my novella called Near Zenner. And yeah, it was something that the three of us experienced together. And one of the friends died not that many years ago, and I had not been in touch with her in many years. But the other friend, my friend Janine, who I had stayed in touch with over the years, and she and I will, you know, when we talk, we'll say, you know, I'll say, what was that? She's much smarter than me. She has a very brainy engineer's brain. So she went to Cornell, and she, was very science and math minded. So I felt like she is not somebody who you would think of as being susceptible to imagining strange things. But yeah, we had a very weird experience. But I think if anybody is interested in reading about it, it's not literally the same in Near Zenner. Sort of the framing story in Near Zenner is different, but when you get to the end of the novella, the experience that the main character has, and also written into the story is the story of three girls who have this inexplicable experience, and the story within the story of those three girls is an account of what happened to us. So I don't know if you can read it online, but it's out there. It's been anthologized. It won the World Fantasy Award. It's one of, I think, probably one of my best stories. It's really, I wanted to write a Robert Aickman story, so that was my homage to Robert Aickman. But yes, so that was my experience, and that's where you can find out about it if you want to read about it. It would take too long otherwise.
That's fantastic. I've had several inexplicable experiences, or experiences that maybe they can be explained. I'm just not the person to be able to explain them. One, I wrote a story for online. You can search for it. It's called The Perfect Roommate. It's probably the most unsettling of the three stories. I haven't actually put the middle story down on paper yet, but I will eventually. And the first one, which I will write sometime, but I found really interesting, was not an experience I had. I lived in an apartment that apparently had a ghost cat, and other people would see it and not me. I would have people come and visit, and they go, "Oh," as they're looking near the front door, they go, "Oh, you have a cat." And I'm like, "No, I do not have a cat." And it just went into that room, and I would, and we would go, and there would be no cat in the room. I would think, oh, somebody, from the hall, the door opened and it snuck in or something. No cat. This happened repeatedly. And then I moved within the building to another apartment, and the cat came with me. And then I left the building, and an ex of mine who still lived there said, "Oh, by the way, so and so moved into your apartment and he got the cat."
That's great.
Coming in and going, "You have this cat," and so and I'm like, and he was like, "I need to get a priest," and of course my ex was going, "You don't need a priest. It's a cat.
It's a cat.
It's not doing anything." So who knows? It may still be there. I have no idea. It was a completely wild thing to have happen. We have, I would say, one last question, which is a fairly, straightforward one. What is the name of your early story about the post-apocalyptic Shakespeare troupe? I'd love to read it.
Well, it's a novel, and it was my first novel, so
right.
You have to give it some slack. It's not a great book. Some people really do love it still, but I think it's because they read it a long time ago. It's called Winter Long, and it's it's kind of a dark, Gene Wolfe influenced post-apocalyptic story. And probably, to be honest, it's probably kind of a hot mess, but it has some good stuff in it, and it was fun to write. It's not. I've never gone back to reread it. I know it's way too long. So, and if you get the British version of it, the UK edition was actually 100 pages longer than the US edition. No, sorry, that's a different book, but it was a bit longer. But anyway, but it's called Winter Long, one word.
Great. We'll take one more question, and it's the last one. And this one again is from Raphael. A lot of your stories deal with artists, as you mentioned, and a lot of your stories are rather dark, verging on horror. Do you think that it's easier to connect a more emotional, intuitive artist sensibility with the perceptions that fuel horror as compared to the analytical engineer's brain?
That's another great question. I think what it is, it's easier to depict it for me on the page. I'm sure somebody could write, and maybe they have, a really effective, scary story about an engineer being haunted by something or having some experience with the supernatural, I would not really probably be able to do a good job with that. And I find that artists' work is they're good channels or vectors for heightened experience, you know. And I think that makes them, you know, very alluring as characters that you can, you know, you can use them and they're experiencing things, but then they're also creating something out of their experience. So on the one level, you get to see what they're feeling and experiencing, but then if they're singing or if they're painting or whatever they're doing, performing a play, then you get to see that as well. So there's just different levels that you can play with, I think, with people in the arts, in fiction.
Absolutely. With that, I just want to say thank you very much. This has been a wonderful conversation. And I know that we could continue talking for another hour without any trouble. But we have to hand it back to our very generous hosts, the Vancouver Public Library, and to Jorge. Jorge, come say hello.
Thank you so much, David.
Oh, thank you so much for both of you. That was such a fascinating conversation, and I love the energy and chemistry you had on and everything you asked. So that was wonderful. I learned a ton. I also want to quickly thank the folks who submitted questions, who were also incredibly thoughtful and brilliant questions. So Heather and Raphael, thank you for joining and enlivening the event. So before I let you all go, I want to share that we are hosting 3 upcoming events very soon. 2 of those events are online. So for those of you who joined from another part of the world, not Vancouver, you can attend those online and you can see them right there on the slides. And also, we are recording this event. So if you have friends who weren't able to attend and you really want them to see this conversation, or you want to relive it or share it in your networks, this conversation is going to live on the library's YouTube channel. So there is an actual playlist where we put these things, and it's the Culture at VPL YouTube playlist, and I just share the link. If you can't remember any of this, don't worry about it. I'm going to send a follow-up email to everyone who registered with a link to this playlist, but also a quick survey, and I'll mention these events that we have coming up. So we're also going to keep this event, the actual webinar, open for another 5 minutes once the 3 of us leave, so that you can click on things. And that's all I got. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, David. What a great conversation. I'm so happy we hosted this. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jorge and David.
Yes,
and
thank you very much for having us. That's been fabulous. Yes. And thank you, Elizabeth, for being so generous with your time and for your answers.
Oh, thank you all.
Goodbye. Thank
Absolutely.
you. See you soon.
Bye-bye.